Hello and welcome to Bondcast, a podcast series where we discuss our views on the latest themes and events shaping rates markets. I'm Imogen Bachra, Head of UK Rate Strategy, and I'm joined today by our global market specialists, Giles Gale and Nevruzi.
All right, let's kick off with the UK this week. We had a lot more data coming in, which pushed yields in one direction, at least in the UK. Gilts have been underperforming all week. What was your take on that?
Yeah, another week of underperformance for gilts. I think we said this, last week, that it's not surprising to see gilts underperform, given that I think it was the Bank of England that shifted most dovishly a couple of weeks ago, and then the data since then has only kind of surprised to the upside. And that's what we saw this week. The big driver of the underperformance, particularly at the front end, was the upside surprise to PMIs. Now, I'd caution a little bit against reading too much into those, given that it was only one print, and it remains to be seen, how much this kind of boost to the survey data is sustained. It wasn't obvious looking at the kind of breakdown from Market, who provides the data, what was really driving that beat versus expectations, because ultimately PMIs printed above 50 rather than below. So actually the signal there was that the recession is off the cards. So it's difficult to read too much into 1 month of data, particularly when the driver of that is not especially clear. Perhaps the final PMI print next week will give us a bit more clarity on whether this kind of boost can be sustained or not. But that was certainly what was driving markets this week. The other bit of important data we had was around public finances. And I think that, that was important, because that too came better than expected. Many were expecting a deficit in January, and it actually posted a surplus. Not as big as we tend to get in January because of the seasonal effects and big tax receipts, but a surplus nonetheless that beat expectations. And this, I guess, is under particular focus at the moment as we head towards the budget and the updated gilt remit on the 15th of March. I guess that my takeaway here would be, again, that I would just caution markets into reading too much about how much of a downside surprise this might mean for gilt issuance next year. We're heading into a pre-election year, which means that any kind of fiscal headroom or fiscal savings that the government have now are really likely to be recycled in some way, either in this spring budget or in the autumn statement, perhaps more likely in the autumn statement, as we're obviously going to be closer to the election kind of campaigning period then. But given how far back in the polls the Conservatives are, I think we are going to see some recycling of that savings this time, in the next couple of weeks. One obvious way that I guess is making more headlines right now is about not raising the EPG, the cap on energy prices, to £3,000 as planned, and keeping that at 2,500. So that's a little bit of cost, I suppose, that might be implied versus what markets were previously expecting might be a saving. I think that, the other point that I would make is also that the pendulum might have swung quite far in the other direction now in terms of the issuance outlook, given these better than expected public finance data, but also given the narrative around how the government might look for alternative sources of funding, if you like, how they might look to do more via NS&I, National Savings and Investment, the kind of retail investment pool, but also how much they might do via bills as well, which would reduce that kind of overall gilt issuance number. But it feels like a combination of that and the better public finance data has kind of shifted market expectations such that actually now the skew of risks may well be to the upside in terms of gilt issuance, and therefore kind of more upward pressure on gilt yields than we were previously expecting.
Right. But that being said, the supply has been, or at least it looked like it was, pretty well digested this week, right?
Yeah, I guess we saw a little bit of supply driving the underperformance at the beginning of this week, but then actually since then, the 30-year auction that we had yesterday, we're recording this on Thursday, so on Wednesday, the 30-year auction, and then also today's short auction from the Bank of England, both went pretty well and actually have been pretty well absorbed by the market, I think. Supply does pick up again next week. Next week, it's much more concentrated at the long end. We have the 38s, we have the long end linker, and we have long Bank of England QT. So it's a bit more kind of long end focused and a bit bigger next week. So there's more duration for the market to take down. And that's then followed up by another week of relatively heavy supply. So there's more to come. And I think that saturation point for markets is probably looming. But it has been a little bit better digested perhaps this week than we expected.
And how does all of that leave your market views then?
Unchanged, really. Given everything that I've said about the data, we still think that the Bank of England has probably one more hike in them. So that takes bank rate up to 4.25% in March. We had Catherine Mann on the wires this morning. She's kind of well understood to be a hawkish member of the committee. In fact, probably the most hawkish member of the committee. But she was talking up the need to kind of still do more. And also pushing back against cut pricing at the back end of this year, which are both kind of in line with our base case views. But given the underperformance that we've seen at the front end, it feels to me like that has adjusted far enough now. The market's pretty fairly priced for our base case, but also the way that the risks are skewed. We recognize that the risks are skewed to the upside on our 4.25% forecast for bank rate. But I think the market has kind of internalized that pretty well since the last MPC meeting, and front ends look more than fairly priced. I would say actually 2 years at kind of 385 look cheap to me, I think. At the other end of the spectrum, although we were talking about supply being better digested than we had expected this week, I still think supply generally has weighed more on the longer end of the curve than it has the belly. And so we've seen this kind of strange curve dynamic where 2s, 10s has flattened very aggressively as markets have repriced their kind of rate hike expectations. But then 10s, 30s has steepened with this kind of supply QT trade. And I think both of those dynamics have probably gone a little bit too far now. And so where we've seen 10-year outperformance on the curve, I would actually expect to see now 10-year underperformance on the curve. And that's a combination of both a rate hike expectations having done enough, but also what I was talking about with the public finances and the focus on the gilt remit. I think that although markets are very focused on the overall number, if that does come slightly lower than we'd been expecting, perhaps that might facilitate a bit more kind of LDI demand sooner rather than later at the longer end of the curve. But perhaps more importantly for the shape of the curve than the outright kind of direction of travel of rates is this skew of issuance in each maturity bucket. And I think it's our base case that issuance will be much more heavily skewed towards the shorts and mediums and away from the long and the linker buckets, which should also kind of weigh on the 10-year sector of the curve more than it weighs on the 30-year, we think. So base case views around the Bank of England and the direction of travel of rates still unchanged. We still see 375 in 10-year gilts, which obviously isn't that much further away now. That's 375 with upside risks. But we do think that the 10-year part of the curve should now underperform versus the 2s and the 30s. Okay, enough from me. Back to you then, Jan. Let's switch to the US. We had a bit of a quieter week this week, I suppose, on the US side, but probably the thing that everyone was most looking out for was the Fed minutes. The minutes are always a funny one, I guess, because you kind of think of them as being a bit old information, especially this time around, given how much has happened since the last Fed meeting, but they're still a policy tool, I suppose. Did we learn anything new from those that is really relevant?
We learned something, but it wasn't really that eventful. Of course, there's some incremental bits of information almost every time, but I should preface why we cared about the minutes this time more so than I should say like the last time around. I think the reasons are twofold. First, at the last FOMC meeting during the press conference, when Chair Powell was asked if they're debating any form of a pause or the path of or alterations in the rate path, his answer was not just unclear, but eventually he kind of finished it off by saying, well, look for the minutes. That's where you're going to see what more of our discussions have looked like. So that set the stage for the minutes for for market participants to look for the minutes. But also on the other hand, over the last weeks, we had a few FOMC officials coming out saying, well, actually, at the last meeting, I thought that was a compelling case for a 50 basis point hike. So the Cleveland Fed's Loretta Mester or St. Louis Fed's Jim Bullard, they both came up and said that in retroactively they advocated for a 50 basis point hike. Well, they're not voters, so their vote, even if they did dissent, it wouldn't have been at the FOMC release. But we wanted to see if the minutes contained discussions around an actual 50 basis point rate hike, or was it one of those things that they retrofit into, well, the jobs number came strong, so that's what I would have done, and with the benefit of hindsight. The minutes did mention a few participants stated that they were looking forward for so they put forward a 50 basis point hike instead of a 25 basis point, and in Fed wording, I suppose few usually means 3 to 4 non-voting members in this case. So there was some views of hiking faster than what they did. It wasn't within the voting committee, so we didn't really get that with the February statement. But that being said, the minutes also looked like, or at least our read on that was that the people who wanted a 50 basis point hike, they didn't really want it to get to necessarily to a higher level of a terminal rate, but rather get there faster and have time to pause and reevaluate. So it wasn't so much of a signal that let's keep hiking until we get to 6% or 5.8 or something like that, but more so let's hike fast and stop and reevaluate and see how the lags in monetary policy are playing out. And that's why there really weren't any fireworks. We knew that we expected to see some discussion of faster rate hikes. We saw that, but nothing was overly emphasized. I think I've mentioned this in previous recordings too, but they certainly have flexibility in adjusting the language and the minutes. They obviously cannot change the topic or add in something entirely that wasn't discussed, but if they do want to send a signal, they could. There was a reference to the strong labor market, which of course we saw with NFPs too, but nothing really to alter our terminal rate expectations so far.
What about the data then? I know, last week was kind of the big data week with inflation, but this week we got the PCE deflator, and today we've had core PCE, and that was again stronger than expected. It feels like the data here is really pointing in one direction. How much does today's data or tomorrow's PCE deflator, I know you're obviously recording this without the benefit of knowing what that number is, but how much does that matter for the Fed?
So today's data revised the fourth quarter PCE for from 3.5% to 3.9%, and that I suppose comes fairly consistently with the revisions in CPI that we had with the last month's data. As listeners will remember, the last CPI number revised the entire, I think in this case it was like 5 years, but the largest revisions are for the past 2 years, and particularly for the last year. So those revisions basically show that inflation didn't slow down as much. It's just more so like seasonal tweaks, but inflation didn't slow as much into the end of the year, but also the peak came at a little bit of a lower level on a seasonally adjusted basis. And the PCE number does look consistent with that. Nothing that surprising, and it doesn't really change our expectation for tomorrow's figure. But on the GDP side, we saw a revision lower in the headline index. So that the GDP number for fourth quarter was revised by 20 basis points lower, from 2.9 to 2.7%. And particularly, what grabbed my attention was the revision in the consumption component, which was brought down from 2.1 to 1.4%. So an indication that the consumer has been slowing down more than we expected, although not really reflected in the January data, which we can talk about. And we have talked about, because it could be seasonality and all sorts of warm weather effects maybe. But yeah, tomorrow we haven't really changed it, but I think back to what I said last week after the CPI, that the weakness that we saw in services in CPI is just not going to spill over that much into PCE because of measurement differences and weighting differences. So we are looking for a firm 0.5 in the PCE read tomorrow.
And for clarity for our listeners, I should have said this at the beginning, but PCE is personal consumption expenditure and CPI is a consumer price index. And they're basically both, different ways of measuring inflation in the economy. Okay, Giles, over to you then, because we also had, it wasn't just the UK, of course, that we had strong survey data. We had it in Europe too, with the PMIs. How much does that matter? And we had more than PMIs as well, of course. We had LEW, LIFO, etc., etc.
Yeah. I mean, listen, it clearly matters, right? But I think it's all really just confirming the theme that really ought to have been expected all along, which is that energy is driving everything, and it's good news for the European economy, and naturally that is boosting business expectations, business sentiment from exceptionally low levels that we did reach last year. I mean, let's not forget that we did reach very, very bad levels. But listen, things are turning around. It's good news. But then I guess the secondary question, well, maybe the primary question really is what all of that means for inflation. And I don't think that it's all that obvious that this is very inflationary. Usually people kind of equate strong growth with stronger inflation, but I don't think you necessarily would immediately make that leap. And it's certainly not viewing it as a game changer for this is what's going to cause inflation to be much slower in returning back towards target. But it does remove or reduce some of the tail risk where inflation collapses because we might have been in a nasty recession in the near term. And so markets are kind of taking that on board as well. Broadly for me, I think that this is all consistent with a sort of softer landing kind of story, and it makes it easier to see the ECB holding at its peak for longer. So I think it's just all in line with that higher for longer story.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about that because we're still slightly more dovish than the market in terms of our ECB expectations. And it really felt like until last week that ECB rhetoric was all one way. But actually, we had Panetta last week and then Valois this week who have been slightly more dovish. You'd say higher for longer, but you still are at the more dovish end of the spectrum. So how do you kind of square, a better data outlook with that more dovish view?
Well, listen, I mean, I think, first of all, you've already said it, that we hadn't heard from the doves for quite a long time. You just heard the hawks repeating the same thing over and over again. I think for us, the story has been that we are expecting a bit of a downgrade to the ECB staff projections in March, in particular for inflation from 2024 and beyond. And along with that, you should expect a softening in the rhetoric, because this is no longer going to be about raising rates quickly and catching up and so on. It's much more, if the data turns out a little bit stronger than expected, maybe we've got a bit more. It's a little bit weaker, maybe we've got a little bit less to do. So data dependency. I think that does seem like it's starting to track as a theme, although we haven't a great, we don't have a lot of we need more data to validate that. But I mean, even though we had an upward revision to the CPI this week, on the back of a higher outturn for Germany compared to what had been sort of imputed by Eurostat. I think it's we shouldn't miss the fact that inflation is coming down more quickly than people thought at the end of last year, and inflation is being led by lower energy prices. And so on the hawk side, they want all the indicators in the same direction, including of course core. Whereas the doves say, wait, no, actually, we don't necessarily need to see core inflation coming off as quick. And by the way, core actually was a little bit higher. It was it ticked up from 5.2 to 5.3%. But that's also being driven by energy prices. And for us, really, and it's the end of last week, nailed it. I mean, he was saying, well, energy is what really is driving everything. That's what matters most, and that's a good story. The energy subsidies, which were supposed to depress inflation, but in 2023, but then as they came off, they were supposed to increase inflation in 2024. Well, they're not going to be needed to be used nearly as much, and so that then also brings down inflation quite a bit. And then on the wages side, well, that's still uncertain, and wages are definitely setting higher, but no higher than had been previously expected. So that's not necessarily tracking worse in the sense that all these things that are going to bring the inflation projections down, but not necessarily push them. You don't have any pushing back on that as aggressive.
And what about the longer end of the curve then? One of the themes we've both been talking about a lot is this kind of risks around supply saturation and indigestion. But actually, in both Europe and the UK this week, it seemed like supply was relatively well absorbed. Would you agree with that? How are the risks tracking for that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, there has been a global theme of bond supply going a little bit, actually being taken down pretty well this week. I think that we have seen yields rise an awful lot, so that should improve the takedown, the demand for these events. If you look at the German supply, there's a 5-year and a 10-year auction. Now there's a little bit funny because there's always there's an element of window dressing, and so I wouldn't overstate. And then by window dressing, I mean that this, banks trying to make their numbers look good because they're hoping for other business good with the finance agency for then there was maybe a little bit of a confusing 30-year syndication in Germany, where yesterday, maybe it was a little bit late in the week, and then they came and announced it, and we had we had quite a big concession as a rise of yields right at the long end to accommodate that, and then there was buying this morning, and that has gone very well as a result of, I suppose, the concession perhaps interest brought in with that or for other reasons. But listen, I don't think this overturns the overall sense that we are experiencing some indigestion. Okay, and I absolutely stick by the idea that investors are. I don't think there's a big positioning overhang or anything like that. Certainly not on the short side, that would be excessively supportive of the market. And I think that investors really, as I've said before, need the comfort that the macro is moving in the right direction ever more decisively in order to take down the supply. And I just think that's going to get worse. And at the moment, we don't have the data tracking in the disinflationary direction as strongly as you would need to see that. So no change really there from us. We're still direction.
Mm-hmm. All eyes on CPI still looking. Okay, I think that's enough for today. We will catch up again next week. Thank you both for joining me, and thank you to our listeners for listening. Just a reminder, if you liked today's episode, please don't forget to hit the like button and click subscribe so you can get the latest episodes as soon as they're available. Thanks, see you next week.